So retail or e-commerce, what's your pick?
I love the e-com game. I think retail was a lot of learning, and I know you really need to figure out how to succeed in retail. But e-com is just it's also instant gratification, right?
And you just pinpoint what you're looking for and buy it.
Yeah, and suddenly we saw orders coming in from all over the country, right? And so it was no longer just the metro cities. And it was just such validation.
After the entrepreneurship is a 24-hour job.
Sometimes it doesn't feel like work, right? Like it's life.
In a retail shop, what is there? Which unit is present? Is it sold or not? This, that. What is it kept next to? All of that becomes a problem.
And say कि यार काम पे जाना है.
हाँ, वो नहीं
होता है. Like you may have the worst problems in the world, but you don't call it calm. You're like, shit, I have to solve this problem.
Hello everyone, welcome to Women Speak. Today we have a woman entrepreneur with us with a stellar background. She has done her undergraduate from London School of Economics and then worked in investment banking. And then she went on to do her MBA from the prestigious Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. She then started her own brand, a health food drinks brand called Smoothies, which scaled and then was acquired by Eat Fit Akka Cure Foods. Please welcome Anusha Bhushan to Women Speak. Hi Anusha, how are you? Thank you for coming to Women Speak.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
You have an entrepreneurship journey where you built something from scratch, you scaled it, and then you finally, sold it and exited the business. So just tell us about your journey. What gave you the idea of this entrepreneurship journey, the product idea? And how did you go about, what were the last 6 years like?
So yeah, I sort of quit my consulting job kind of mid-2015 or so and decided that I want to do something in clean label packaged foods, right? So that was the sort of thesis with which I had sort of said that this is the space I want to work in. Where that was coming from was, I think back then especially, there were very select few supermarkets that used to carry a range of health foods. Very often things would be very, very expensive, so I kind of felt like it wasn't accessible, affordable enough to a slightly larger market. That was the sort of reason why I said, let's see if I can figure out something which is not only natural and healthy, but also affordable, also accessible with respect to distribution. Kind of took 2015 to 2016 kind of figuring that out. And then at some point I narrowed down on beverages. Where beverages came from again was, I think one, there were very few people working in that space. It's also a very difficult space to work in. Liquids come with a whole bunch of challenges. But we launched a brand called Smoothies. The principles around which we sort of centered the entire product was 100% natural, no added sugar and no preservatives. When we first started, we were actually a lot more idealistic. Like we said, no water in the product and absolutely nothing except for fruit in the bottle. But over time, of course, as we spoke to consumers, we realized that to give them a product that they really, really like, sometimes you have to start adding things just to make it a little bit more palatable for them as well. But yeah, so we launched in 2016 and started in Bangalore. 2 years later, sort of moved to the Bombay market as well. We took a very idealistic approach to this, which was if it's a health product, it also has to be very, very high quality, which means it needs to be in our control. So we ran a manufacturing unit. Right,
so you started in Bangalore?
Yeah. Okay. So in fact, started tabletop. Started in my kitchen and said, I don't think I can make more than 100 bottles a day, but let's do it that way. And then moved the 100 to 400, the 400 to 700.
Wow. At what scale were you still operating in your home?
Well, because it was a food business, the moment we realized we needed licenses to actually start officially selling, we moved out, right? So we did like maybe the first few flea markets out of my home. And maybe within 4 or 5 months, we had our own space. The space was small. The space was still very tabletop.
You rented out a space and you created your manufacturing.
We did, yeah.
Wow.
In fact, the first office was very interesting because it was an office. And we cleared out the furniture in one room and we put kind of steel furniture and things that can afford to get sort of wet and have like food on them, right? And we said this is the manufacturing room. And then we had refrigerators in another room, and we said this is the packaging and the storage room, and then the rest of the rooms are for the team, right?
And did you invest in machines and all for the bottling and everything, or that you were doing manually in the beginning, and then
So
how did it?
every piece of machinery came in incrementally. So the way we did this is we started with like a tabletop machine. So typically in beverages, the biggest challenge is how to give a product shelf life. Now we were again very idealistic about this, saying we want to give it shelf life, but we don't want to overprocess. Overprocessing loses nutrition and it loses flavor. So what kind of process can we impose on the product that allows us a happy middle ground between them? We sort of got tabletop machinery just for the pasteurizing to start with. Everything else was manual. Once we got control over that, then we said, okay, now we need to figure out how to scale that process. Can we do this at 50 liter batches? Can we do it in 100-liter batches? And then bit by bit, we added on the filling, the capping, all of those sort of pieces through machinery over the years. So we took our time in mechanizing everything.
And then you said you expanded to Mumbai.
We did, yeah.
How was that? You set up another manufacturing there.
We were actually sending product from Bangalore. So the entire 7-8 year journey was with one large manufacturing unit in Bangalore. But the way we would do this is we would send fresh stock to Mumbai every week.
So using what, cold storage, and like what's the process of, logistics for food which has a shelf life and is also in breakable bottles? So what do you do?
It is very interesting actually. So we tried a bunch of different things, right? Again, so usually with food, when you're not at scale, you can't afford refrigerated trucks, right? Typically, the way you want to do this is you want to rent a truck and you tell them that this is the temperature range at which my food needs to be transported, and it goes end to end in the truck and is monitored and all of that until it reaches the warehouse on the other end, right? Now, obviously, as we scaled, we started getting to those kind of volumes, but right at the start, we were sending 200 bottles and 400 bottles at a time to Mumbai. And but of course, temperature control was important. So what we did is we bought these temperature sensors. For around 2-3 weeks, we only ran tests. So we bought thermocol boxes, we bought kind of insulated boxes, put the temperature sensor in, packed a number of bottles and left them outside for like 3 days at a time, right? So Bangalore to Mumbai is actually an 18-hour journey.
Yeah.
Right. So we tested for, let's say, 2 days at a time, 3 days at a time, and just checked if the temperature in the box was sufficient enough for us to send it by road. And when I say by road, we would send it on a bus. So it would be an unsupervised bus. One person would put the boxes on one end and the other would pick it up on the other end. So it's like absolute, in that sense, like hustle, right? Just to be able to open up a new market. But it was, and it was fun, right? And actually, to address your glass bottles thing, we used to literally throw boxes across the office, fully packed boxes, just to check if the glass bottle will break. I have some really funny videos of it actually. My co-founder would sort of pack everything and say, I think this one is going to work, right? And like literally throw it like 20 feet across the office.
We'll add this video after this conversation in the podcast.
Yeah, I'll try and find it actually. And then open it up to see whether it survived or not, right? Not because like all of our boxes actually get thrown around like that, but in D2C.
No, it's possible. It's definitely possible. People throw around our packets and, well, apparel doesn't get spoiled, but we have some products like gift boxes and all, and the box entirely gets damaged before it reaches the customer.
Yeah.
So you have to bubble wrap it and, do all those things to protect it. But glass bottles, I don't have the heart to try.
So, I mean, I think the glass versus plastic debate was like, we had it so many times. And we actually had plastic in between for maybe like a year, right? But I think, so 2 things happened, right? Plastic compromised our shelf life. When we moved back to glass, we realized we were able to sort of deliver 2-3 times the shelf life and just a safer product, right? Like there was considerably less
because
spoilage.
Of microplastics or what? Why would it reduce your shelf life? Because glass keeps cooler longer?
Because glass is a 100% oxygen barrier. So plastic is still a little bit porous, which basically means that any bacteria that you have in the product can thrive because oxygen is moving in and out. With glass, whatever is in the product, that's all it has to feed on and nothing else. Because that's all that microbes want, right? They want sugar, so something to feed on, and they want something to breathe with. So glass is just a great gas barrier more than anything else. And to add to it, of course, the microplastics argument which is actually the second thing that happened, right? Which was consumers came back to us and said, we want your glass bottles back. I think that's when we realized, it's a health product, it's a health brand. Our consumers are aware. They want the most sort of elevated, the most premium experience as well. And they want to feel like they're having something that's ultimately very, very healthy for you, right? Not just what you're drinking in the bottle, but the quality of the bottle itself. So we moved back to glass then.
The whole sustainable perception of the brand increases
absolutely
a lot.
Yeah.
When you're switching away from plastic.
Yeah. I have this investor deck which I had sent out to just my investors, right? So like internal investors, which was the day we made the switch from plastic to glass. I put a line on the chart and I showed them the uptick in sales because it was mental. Like I didn't expect it. I didn't expect that kind of...
Even the value of cost increases, but your sales also increase.
Yeah, absolutely. Cost definitely increased, but I think even our consciences felt a little bit clearer, right? Like both my co-founder and I are very particular about the choices that we make in our personal life, and for us, work is not... We don't like to think of work as separate from
who you are.
Yeah, from who we are. So to some extent, when we made that switch to plastic, we were feeling very uncomfortable about it, but we said it's a cost. It's a cost decision, right? Like it is something that we sort of almost need to do, or that's what we thought, right? And then at some point, I think we just said, nay, if consumers want it, if there is a product reason to do it as well, and we as a company would just feel so much better if we were doing the responsible thing, then let's figure out some of the hard problems with time, but let's switch back to glass. So we did that. No regrets.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. So you said you started the company in 2016 and then you expanded in Bangalore first, then Mumbai first. But what were your first sales channels? Where did you start selling? After the flea markets, what were your formal sales channels, and how did you grow between e-commerce and retail? So what was that journey like?
So we were very idealistic about the way we went around our go-to-market strategy, right? So we said, this is an FMCG product. We never thought of ourselves as a D2C brand, right? Also back in 2016, D2C wasn't even a thing, right? But we said this is an FMCG product, whether it is today or whether it is 5 years later, at some point we have to figure out retail. And retail is where we have to win. So we actually started with retail. Kind of maybe 3-4 years into our journey, we had a very strong retail footprint in Bangalore. So when I say retail, we largely did modern trade. We did a little bit of general trade as well. So the smaller kind of kirana stores. But our focus was very much on modern trade. Where that changed again for us was when the pandemic hit. So a lot of things changed for us in the pandemic. But one of the sort of decisions that we had to take was to pull out of retail because we had no visibility into when retail was going to come back as a channel. And retail is an expensive channel to service, right? Like it does cost, it costs money to have people servicing stores. You have to spend on visibility. You have to spend on discounts. You can't put retail on maintenance. You always have to take care of it as a channel. So we actually pulled out of almost 80% of the stores we were in and said, let's rebuild online. So from 2020 onwards was when largely we started making investments in marketplaces, quick commerce, our own website as well. Earlier, our own website was just a landing page, right? Like you couldn't place an order on our site, right? We had just decided it's beverage doesn't make sense. And then suddenly in 2020, everybody's sitting at home and they're like, tell me how to place an order. So Shopify Zindabad, right? Like just quickly set up a Shopify site and went live. It worked out well. I think we lost a lot of revenue by pulling out of retail, but that was the compulsion. Like we just needed to do it at that point in time.
So food, drinks, FMCG is a very difficult business because it comes with a shelf life. So, how do you ensure that the products that you're putting out in the market get sold completely? How do you manage your inventory? And then if the shelf life is over, do you take products back? What happens in FMCG?
Typically in FMCG, especially for young brands today who don't have a lot of sort of power to command and market, you do have to take products back if they don't sell. The onus is typically on the brand to figure out how much to put on shelf. One of the models that we sort of learned once we started going into retail is retailers would sell on consignment basis, which means Give us as much stock as you want, put it on shelf. Whatever doesn't sell anyway, we're going to give it back to you. So it does mean that sometimes you have buyers who are making irresponsible decisions, saying, "Bej do, 100 piece bej do." But they don't really know what's happening on shelf, or how much inventory is sitting at the back. So we actually started tracking that ourselves, right? So it is an intensive process.
Because everybody will have a different technological system in modern trade.
And some of them have no system, right?
Exactly.
Like sometimes I had to send salespeople to the store and say, ki count karke leke aao, right? Ki how many of, and it's deep, right? Because you look at how many of each product and how much shelf life of each product do you have on shelf. But we tracked all of that for around, I think 80 stores in Bangalore. And whenever we had reports, of course, we would use those. But very often, I think we were just like operating on Excel spreadsheets. And at any point of time in Smoothies, after production, the operations team was the largest. Just managing this, right? Like managing stock was I think the largest optimization problem that we had at all points in time. So it was managing stock, right, from obviously raw material stock and all of that to how much finished goods is sitting with us. Even that has to be minimized, but not so low that if an order comes in, you miss it because you don't have enough stock at that moment to give it. And then you have to track how much to put on shelf at a store, how much to take off. So expiry stock is also our responsibility to make sure that you're taking it off so that a customer doesn't buy one. And then what to do with the bottles after they come back, right? So we used to reuse the glass bottles, but that itself is it's a logistical exercise, right? You don't reuse the caps, you empty the bottles, you have to wash and sterilize every single one of them such that it is equivalent to a new glass bottle that you bought from the manufacturer.
And what do you do with the returned stock?
Nothing. You can't do anything with it.
Just throw it.
You have to throw it. We ran a few experiments where we said, can we bring it back with enough shelf life on it such that we have enough time to donate it, maybe?
Yeah.
But it's a very hard problem to solve. So we did that to some extent. We did that in Bangalore. We can't do it in Mumbai, right?
Yeah.
So at some point we realized that if we're scaling and if we're moving, and as we move the business to online, there is no return mechanism really. Like you're shipping it out using a ship rocket or a delivery, right? And you can't really bring bottles back then. So
retail or e-commerce, what's your pick?
I love the e-com game. Like I think retail was a lot of learning. And I know you really need to figure out how to succeed in retail. But e-com is just, it's also instant gratification. Right?
Exactly.
And
you just pinpoint what you're looking for and buy it. You don't, while there are obviously catalogs and everything, but if you know what you're looking for, you'll get it easily.
Yeah.
In a retail shop, what is there, which unit is present, is it sold or not, this, that, what is it kept next to, all of that becomes a problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And then obviously fulfilling all these products into hundreds of retail stores. Again, that is a logistical challenge that you just described.
Yeah. And, I think larger brands today, when they're going into retail, they have distributors, they go into existing networks. So, you send cases and cases of product to the distributor who already has another 5 beverage brands or, sort of related kind of brands, right? Where the distribution footprint is similar. You don't really have to think too much ki product pahunchega ki nahi shelf pe, ki kya karna hai. But as a small brand with very little shelf life and no distributor wants to touch you when you're small, right?
Yeah.
I tried it as well. We tried talking to distributors and one or two.
Yourself only supplying to modern trade.
Yeah, which is why it was city by city. So we had a delivery team in Bangalore and we built a delivery team in Bombay. Just to be able to do this.
Yeah, otherwise FMCG without distribution is
very hard, very, very hard. Yeah. Which is why D2C and like online was such a breath of fresh air, right? It was like, I can learn now big right. हाँ.
कुछ करना नहीं पड़ना,
box pack करके रख दूंगी. कोई आके लेके चला जाएगा. Yeah, and suddenly we saw orders coming in from like all over the country, right? And so it was no longer just the metro cities. And it was just such validation ki ठीक है, like all these years we've
But you got airship liquids also, no? वो problem भी आया होगा.
We did.
But वो उसका एक limit होता है ना, 100 ml or something. I guess below that it was. I don't know.
No, it was not below. Like, in fact, we used to sell 8 bottles at a time, 200 ml.
Oh.
Actually, we didn't do air shipping though. It was all road. Yeah, it was all road. That was one of the things I think that some of our consumers did say कि यार मैं दिल्ली में हूँ और आप कह रहे हो कि 5 दिन लगेंगे. then that is what it is, right? And then, of course, maybe by 2021, 2022, we had started. So we had a hub in Delhi and we had a hub in Mumbai and Bangalore, of course, to be able to slightly shorten those delivery timelines. But Bihar, Calcutta, all of those pockets of the country used to take 5-7 days to reach.
Yeah.
But kar dete the, right? Like suddenly you feel ki there is a
While drink wahabi boy.
हाँ, एक दिन वहाँ पे distributor मिलेगा.
Yeah, it finally becomes, as you scale your business, it finally becomes a distribution challenge.
Yeah.
That how do you reach all your customers with intent?
Yeah.
There will be always a lot more customers with intent, but reaching them always becomes a problem.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that was one of our challenges as well, right? Which was, as a premium brand, as a slightly niche brand, you know that there's a market, but that market is distributed across a very large country. How do you reach those customers?
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem that a lot of people, a lot of D2C brands have today, right? Which is, at some point, performance marketing stops performing. Like, everybody goes into it and starts putting money into it because in the beginning, the metrics look great.
Yeah.
As you scale your budgets, as you go deeper and deeper into markets, you realize, I don't know how to reach my next 100,000 customers.
Exactly. So that's what I always say. It's very easy to scale a business from 0 to 1 crore.
Yeah.
Then the 1 to 5 crores is the next challenge.
Yeah.
Then 5 to 10 crores makes it more difficult. But the journey from 10 to 100 crores is the most challenging.
Very hard.
Because it's like, how do you reach so many people to reach that number?
Yeah.
So I think that, and that's where performance marketing becomes difficult. Because performance marketing will be, excellent and will give you great results till the time you reach 10 CR. After that, it will be like a decreasing ROAS for all the money that you put in after that, because I think that the threshold sort of gets exhausted.
Yeah. And you build your economics around your previous economics, right? Like your margin profile, your profitability, all of that is modeled on what numbers you already see.
Exactly. And then you're like, okay, पैसा तो जा रहा है marketing में, but sale नहीं आ रही.
हाँ, नहीं बिल्कुल. I think it's really hard at some point to scale when you're exclusively online.
Yeah.
We were, to some extent, I think, almost exclusively online at the end of it, right? Like, we had a little bit of retail. We had a lot of Cloud Kitchen customers. That's where the EatFit deal came from, actually. EatFit was one of our larger customers. But outside of QSR and Cloud Kitchen, everything was online. And I just, like, at some point, I could see the metrics turning. And he said, I don't know what next. So that was a challenging period to sort of figure out, like, how to get consistent growth.
Yeah.
That was hard. Yeah.
So how did the EatFit deal came about? How did they first reach out to you, and what was the whole process of valuing the company? How long did that take? And then finally, how did you even decide to sort of give away your PB startup and then decide that, okay, this is the right course of action? Because as an entrepreneur, I know that you get emotionally involved in whatever you're building, and it becomes a piece of your heart. So it's not an easy decision, but sometimes I guess it makes sense. So what was it for you, and what were the drivers that...
Where the process to sell sort of came from, and where we were kind of thinking that maybe this makes sense, is when we realized that we had sort of hit our ceiling on how much capital we could raise, right? So, and maybe, I won't go into why we were not able to raise enough or what mistakes we made, but like, over the years, we raised small amounts of capital every year and kind of dripped that into the business. Typically, what happens with that is you can't make large sort of investments in growth because you're always worried that my runway is going.
You're bridging the gap most.
Yeah, you're always bridging the gap. You're always doing incremental growth. For us, so we lost a fundraise at the start of the pandemic. There was a certain amount which was almost guaranteed to come in at the end of April 2020. Obviously, that didn't happen, and we found ourselves stuck with like 3 to 4 months of runway. And that's kind of where the pull out of retail happened as well, and a couple of those difficult decisions we had to take. But somewhere around then was also when the capital raising challenges became infinitely harder. We had very supportive investors who had been investing into us every year, right? Somewhere between 2021 and 2022 was when we realized that while we were growing, we were not growing fast enough to be able to convince the market to give us capital. And and the only way to grow fast enough is to get the capital. So it was a little bit of a like a vicious cycle, right? So very difficult decision, I think. But my co-founder and I both sort of had that discussion and did a little bit of soul searching and said, there are people who we employ. There is a brand that we've built. There is value in this business today, but it will slowly erode to maybe nothing, right? If we don't sort of maybe proactively decide that perhaps there's somebody else out there with an existing platform who can grow this brand and sort of take it over in a way, right? We were very open to be fair, we were very open to also continue building maybe along with the strategic. I think the way things worked out with EatFit overall was that, we both took a call also ki, maybe it'd be nice to sort of start afresh, and EatFit gave us the freedom to do that as well. We had a very nice relationship with EatFit because they were customers. So they were customers of ours since 2020. And so
they used to source from you and sell on EatFit.
Yeah. Yeah. So they bought the smoothies products. We did a few customizations for them as well as our relationship got deeper with them. So we knew them very well. They'd seen the brand grow on the platform, so they understood the potential. What's very nice about the way kind of EatFit works as well is they're very data driven. So they look at ratings, they understand how products sell, why they're selling. So they had a fair amount of conviction that, the smoothies brand is something that will work. Where it also, I think, made sense for them was, of course, running the manufacturing unit and sort of getting that extra margin that otherwise was ours is a profitable, it's a reason to make an acquisition, right? To say, I want to own that extra margin. I can't quite remember if we reached out or they reached out, but it just sort of fit in that sense. Difficult decision. Obviously, I think no founder really starts out saying, I'm going to sell this while the business is relatively young, because we were relatively young. But I'm very grateful for an exit. I think not everybody gets one when they want to or when they need one.
It's always like, leaving the match on a high. Like all athletes want to retire when they are at your peak. Or when they know that, not at your peak actually, but when they know that after this, they may not, win another title. Or is it like that? Is that analogy correct?
I wouldn't want to say that we were on a peak, right? Like, again, because we were thinking...
Not the peak, I meant that, this is the twilight of the peak.
Yeah, I think that might be the right way to put it.
Yeah.
Which was, I couldn't see another way to thrive.
Yeah.
And so we said, and we threw a lot of energy behind it as well. Like you said, let's like make an exit happen, because I think we did our best to fundraise as well. It's just, it didn't seem to be the right thing to do at that point. Yeah.
So you come from investment banking and consulting background, which the two industries have some of the highest pay, in the market. And then you started to, bootstrap your own business. And so how was the shift from becoming like an employee, having some fixed hours, fancy travel, to then becoming an entrepreneur and, figuring out your own funds? So what was it like?
So first, I think with banking and consulting, there's no such thing as fixed hours. And the reason why I focus on that is because that was one of the big thoughts going on in my mind कि अगर इतना काम करना है तो खुद के लिए काम करो.
आप पता, entrepreneurship is a 24-hour job.
I mean, sometimes it doesn't feel like work, right? Like it's life. And maybe it's a very idealistic way of looking at entrepreneurship, but I found it was a very rare occurrence for me to wake up any day while I was an entrepreneur and say कि यार काम पे जाना है.
वो नहीं
होता है. Like you may have the worst problem in the world, but you don't call it calm. You're like, shit, I have to solve this problem, right? That's the way you think through it. Versus obviously when you're in a job, it is different, right? So I did my first few years as an analyst in banking, and then I straight out of B school I did I worked with Bain for a bit in Mumbai. I think where my mind was made up sometime during the consulting gig was because banking kar liya tha, right? And this was banking in London, so very glamorous, right? I had the I'm still not technically supposed to tell you my client names, but I had some really top-notch clients that we were working with, global global players, and I worked across industries and all of that. So I'd gotten that experience. I don't regret it at all. Like, right, I don't know if I can say I loved every day of it, but I appreciate the grounding and the sort of I don't know, the I guess the work ethic that it puts in you, right? When you're, because it was 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day very often. But I think somewhere when I did the whole sort of routine again during the consulting thing, I said, if I am going to work so hard, right, which seems to be my fate, like I seem to have fallen into two roles which have that kind of intense lifestyle, then let me do this for myself, right? I'm very aware, of course, that it also comes from a point of privilege where I could take that step back and say, ki, chalo, let's not earn, right, for a few years. It's okay. We'll figure it out, right? And I think that comes from again just having that qualification, right, where you can say, worst case kya hota hai, right? Get a job, right? Mil jayega job. So for me, I think that was the thinking, ki kar liye, right? Like done the corporate gigs, realized that there was something missing, really wanted to learn, like really wanted to go deep into business. I think at some point during the consulting gig, I realized I really do want to learn how to be a good operator. And you can work with as many industries as you want in consulting, but you'll never be the decision maker in that business, right?
Yeah, you're always building a hypothesis for a client, because I also come from a consulting background.
Yeah.
So you're always like, building a pitch kind of a thing, which your client may or may not agree to implement finally.
Exactly. And even the advice you give is sometimes with very little knowledge, right? Like, I mean, if you think about it, like the kind of advice that that I was sort of helping or working with my team on giving, then why am I qualified to do this? I don't know anything about this industry. So it's very good learning, but it's finger deep, right? And so if you find the industry that you're really passionate about, it makes sense to jump straight into it. I'm very fortunate, I think, to have found, I won't say food, but like kind of consumer products as something that I really enjoyed doing. So yes, I think for me that was where the sort of thinking came from. Okay, let's do it. I also decided to do it when I was young, right? So I started up when I was 27.
Started Smoothies when you was 20.
I started Smoothies when I was 27. I think a lot of people said that, you're really young, why don't you work for a little bit longer? And in one sense, I get the logic, right? Ki, put more money in the bank, get more experience, do all of that. But in like the only thing that was going on in my head was, I'm young, I have energy, and I have time to lose today. If I make a few mistakes, it's okay. It's a very long career. I've done this early in my career. If I want to do either entrepreneurship 2.0 or just go back into the job market or whatever, this stint will not maybe possibly hurt my career as much as if I do this 5 years or 10 years later when there is a career to lose. So that was kind of where I was thinking about it. And I was like, I basically have no responsibilities today. I was very risk loving. I said, it's okay, cut there. So yeah, I think that's how it all started.
Your risk appetite built your drink appetite. But then investment banking and consulting are also two very male-dominated fields, especially at the top. Because, as you rise and become partners, and both of these industries requires you to travel a lot, live out of the suitcase, have very long working hours, which obviously women cannot sustain during the motherhood age. It's possible till the time they have children, and then obviously after the children become 6, 7, 8 years old, then they can jump right back into it. But during those 7, 8 years that they need, to get into the family mode and take care of children, do you think that that's a true perspective, or is it manageable to do that? Or entrepreneurship gives more wings and flexibility to women to thrive? So what's your point of view on that?
I think there are industries which are challenging. They're challenging for anybody. The reason why it is, again, I think more challenging for women is, one, maybe for the first few years, there's a biological reason why you need to be around. And then post that, there's an emotional reason why you want to be around. Like around your kids, right? So it does become a little bit harder to be able to dedicate the same amount of bandwidth, right? Mental bandwidth, or just time at a banking job or a consulting job. Having said that, I think I know some rock stars who've done it. Taken the maternity leave off and then come back. and really thrived, right? And said that, consulting is what we really like, and so we'll make it work. I'd like to hope that over time there are not exceptions and that there are people just figuring out how to do it. But I think they've also done it because they know that they not only have a support system and a supportive office, but also a support system at home. And I mean, coming to that, I think like you asked about the contrast between like this and entrepreneurship. Like entrepreneurship gives you flex. I think to some extent it depends on how much flex you want to take, right? So entrepreneurship can have so many different ways to do it.
I think it makes you a lot more at stake. So it might give you flexibility, but there's so much more at stake that you can't do much with that flexibility.
Exactly, right? Like if you're, and I think it also comes down to aspiration, right? And like, there are people who run, let's say, lifestyle businesses, right? Saying it is entrepreneurship and it's a beautiful way of living your life, right? Saying I'm content with what I have, and this is a profitable business, and I don't want to push really, really hard, but this is what it is. There maybe you get a little bit more flex, right? Versus, if you are running on the VC treadmill, or if you are trying to scale rapidly, then while like flex could very well mean ki I'm going to work from home, but it doesn't mean that you don't work. It doesn't mean that you're not mentally sort of tuned into your business all the time. Like I always tell people, flex is not the reason to be an entrepreneur. And you need to be an entrepreneur because you want to be an entrepreneur. You have to love the idea of building a business. Along the way, you can build your life into the way you work, but it is tough, right? It is still a tough life.
So, as a woman entrepreneur, what do you think are the difficulties which women face in the industry as women founders? And there's always a lot of talk in the industry about either betting on them or having some kind of a preconceived notion that women are softer. Have you faced any such challenge, or do you have any story to tell on that?
Women do have an obvious disadvantage in the funding domain. It is, a lot of people talk about it. It is harder to get funded as a woman. I had a male co-founder, so I sometimes feel like I don't know whether I have the right to complain about this, but I do know, like, I think women founders, especially those who are solo, find it very difficult. So that's a huge disadvantage, I would say. I mean, over and above, I think comes down to the industry as well that you're working in. I found myself having to really double down on trying to, because, it was also food business. So, food businesses can be small scale and can scale to kind of many hundred crores. And very often, again, because of that preconceived notion that, oh, she's a woman and she's running a food business, maybe the aspirations are small, right? So I found myself having to justify that very often with customers, with investors, of course, or even with vendors, right? Saying, hey, I may be small today, but I will not be in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. And so if there are investments to make with me, make them. Overall, I think it is harder for women.
Do you think that the struggles that we face as women entrepreneurs make us feminists and like, okay, girl, you got to do this, and then I'm not going to listen to any bullshit? Do you think that it brings out an entire feminist rage in you because you're a woman entrepreneur?
So I personally am a very calm person. It takes a lot to get me angry or to actually go into a rage. But yes, I think when somebody treats you unfairly or doesn't give you like your due, it does make you want to prove them wrong, right? I've done this with family. I've done this with anybody really, right? Who sort of just says कि वो पता नहीं क्या कर रही है. So yeah, there are times I think where you literally want to say कि see देखो मैंने दिखा दिया ना.
Well, success is the sweetest revenge.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think everybody's a feminist in their own way. I think anybody who believes that they are equal is a feminist, right?
So now we will go on to our rapid segment round. And we'll make it fun.
Okay.
And then we'll end up with some question related to your new canvas of life. Biggest challenge, funding or finding the right team?
Funding. Definitely.
Okay, as a dog person, if your business could have a canine mascot, what breed would it be and why?
So I think for me, golden retrievers through and through. I have one at home. I had one growing up. So they're just they're gentle, they're friendly, they're beautiful souls.
What's the most empowering quote you keep close for those tough entrepreneur days?
So there's something that my husband and I say at the breakfast table quite often. Whenever we feel like, life is unfair, which is, karam kiye ja, phal ki chinta na karo. It sort of fits into our overall like life thing, right? Just keep work hard. At some point, it will work out for you, right? Whether just sort of in this gig or in life, it will work out, right? Do the right things, put in the input, output will come.
What's the most valuable lesson your business has taught you about yourself?
I think that I don't like injustice. But for me, like, I think injustice is across anything, right? Like, even in terms of business practices, I found my best relationships were with people who always like chose to do the right thing. Or like, even employees who just did good for the company and allowed us then to also repay that back to them, right? Or, suppliers who believed in us. When you see, for example, competitors thriving and you know that there is maybe either something wrong with their formulations or that there is somewhere where there's a cheating happening. It used to give me a lot of anguish because we used to always do the right thing. But I also realized it derived a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of always saying that I know I'm doing the right thing, so I am in the right. Like, that was important to me.
Women-led businesses are more focused on this doing the right thing part.
I think so. I see it, at least. It's there in the numbers. Like, you and I know so many kind of women founders who are trying to do good businesses, right?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for why.
I feel that, due to the inherent nurturing nature of a woman, the first criteria becomes doing the right thing and then doing the sales. Whereas the bread nature of the man makes it, the biological conditioning is such that, okay, let me get the sales first and then I'll worry about the...
It's actually possible, yeah. It's like instinct to attack versus instinct to take care.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
If you could give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
Don't take yourself so seriously. It's a long career, it's a long life. Ho jayega.
So if you had a superpower, what would it be?
If I could read minds, I would really want to do this. I'm serious. I think one of the things I really struggled with is I'm a very candid person, right? So I am so candid that it's very hard for me to hide my thoughts, even if I want to. It either shows up on my face or I just say it. I prefer to be authentic. And I think some hard lessons I've learned over the years is not everybody is. Which means in any conversation, any negotiation, anything, really speaking, what I've had to learn how to do, and I still don't like the fact that I have to do it, is to hear what the person's saying and then also think about what the person's thinking and what the person will do, even though he said that he'll do something else, or she. I would love to have that superpower to actually understand somebody's genuine intent.
Like the friend saying, if you know, you know, you know, you know, you know.
Exactly.
So that will just complicate the mind too much. Already it is so complicated. What's the one productivity hack that you swear by?
Okay, so this is a weird one. But basically, I think, again, as a founder, you've got so many different things to do. Some things require like deep work. And those are the very obvious things that I do for productivity. So, listen to music, silent hours, don't allow anybody to talk to you and all of that. And then you put a bunch of different things which are so boring, right? Like whether it's making payments or whether it's going through paperwork, like things which dimag nahi lagta, bas time lagta hai. So I sometimes take that stuff back home. And I put on a Friends episode, something that I watched 100 times. And for whatever reason, it makes me more productive because TV to dekhna nahi hai, dekh liya episode 100 baar. But it just creates a mahal where I'm like, theek hai, kaam khatam karo. But I don't feel like I'm wasting my working day on dumb work. So just it makes me like a lot more productive at doing things like that. Just have something running in the background and just get it done and finish it off. And I always do it at home. I don't do boring work or like admin work. I never do that in the office.
I think Friends is everybody's go-to like series for all the mundane things in their life, or the sorrowful things, or the boring things, and it just makes life interesting.
Yeah.
To make an important decision, would you listen to your mentor or your gut feeling?
Now I listen to my gut. When I was younger, I would probably listen to my mentor.
What's your opinion on mentorship and coaching as a professional and an entrepreneur? At what stage do you think one needs it? And how does one decide to go for it?
Like formal coaching is something I have done a couple of times. And I've done them at phases where I have felt very like directionless, or I have felt I need a platform to be able to voice my thoughts, right, and to put structure to them. I found it tremendously helpful. Really enjoyed the process as well. Difficult process. You really have to like open yourself up to somebody, and it's not like therapy, right? But it is still establishing a relationship of trust with somebody on the other end, and showing up with discipline, right? Showing up like every week or whenever your appointments are to do it. Very, very helpful. But I think, it needs to be at a time when you are willing to reevaluate some of your own, like you need to have a certain level of self-awareness to be able to make the most out of a coaching relationship. In one sense, you need to be able to sort of get feedback from your coach and internalize it and say, hey, this is like cast your ego aside and say, this person is here to help me. So maybe like a mid-career sort of stage as well, when you've had enough problems as well. So you have situations and scenarios where you can apply that advice to. And honestly, like where you have problems that you want to solve, right? And I wouldn't recommend somebody in their 20s to do it. Because you're still exploring, you're still like, you don't really, I think there's like, the path is too open for you to really, I think, need coaching in that sense. Every opportunity is an opportunity.
I guess in 20s, people should have mentors, and maybe in your 30s,
you have coaches. Yeah, correct.
So who's the woman entrepreneur that you look up to and you follow the journey and been inspired by?
So I don't know if she qualifies exactly as an entrepreneur, but I have loved the journey of Indra Nooyi. I think she's very interesting, right? I mean, I don't know if you read her book, but
yeah,
it's a fascinating read.
Oh yeah, it's very good.
And her views on, like even her views on sort of women and how technically you can't have it all. Like I find it to be a very nice, like a nuanced view to it. Right? It's very practical. Like it really made me think when I read about her journey. And you're talking about a person who is, hit the peak of almost what any career could achieve, right? And she's done it with the entire sort of backdrop and context of an Indian family and an Indian upbringing, which is harder on women than other societies are. So I find that to be like tremendously inspirational.
Yeah. I think her book also changed my perspective on parenting and motherhood and all the challenges that come with it. Because she describes her motherhood experience and how she quickly went back to work within 2 months, 3 months, and had like her mom coming over and taking care of her children and, missing some of their events at school.
Yeah.
And all. And I was like, okay, I mean, it's fine, as long as you know that your children are safe, but your career demands something and you're setting an entire life example, role model example for them. It's okay, because women beat themselves down a lot.
Yeah.
For, even small things like that. Even for a 2-day trip or one event missed or something. But I think that opened me up that it's okay, it's fine.
Yeah. I think women need to stop trying to be perfect, right? And perfect at home, perfect at work, all of it, right? Like,
yeah.
It's okay to drop the ball sometimes, or it's okay to rely on somebody else to help you out, right? Like her book was in that sense, it was a story of like hard truths, right?
Yeah.
Which is that if you want to achieve there, you have to compromise somewhere. But that doesn't mean that was a bad compromise to make, right? You asked for help. And I'm guessing the artist self was egoless, right? Trying to fly relatives in from India just to take care of your kids. I'm sure that's not easy, but it's a choice that you make, and then you live with it very happily, right? Saying my kids are taken care of. It's so it's not the most encouraging or like super motivational for all women. I do realize that. I think some people took objection to some of her views as well on women in the workplace, but I mean, she's a living example of
And
how to do
who is a woman from, the 70s who then made it big. And, it was at a time where there were not even many women in profession, in that kind of a profession, in marketing, then sales, and becoming a CFO, and then leading one of the world's largest FMCG organizations. So yeah, I found it really inspiring.
Yeah.
So when you look back the last 7-8 years of your journey, is there anything that you would want to change about it? Anything that you hope that you'd done differently?
I mean, I think strategically, of course, there are a lot of different things, maybe product choices, channel choices that we would have maybe done differently. But I think overall, maybe really speaking, if I had to think of one thing that we should have done very, very differently, was been very aggressive at the start. The way we, and the way I had sort of visualized it was, we'll spend a year or two figuring out the consumer, figuring out the product. We'll do these flea markets. We'll get a basic sort of pulse of the market. And then at some point, we'll go and raise money. What also happens is if you don't, let's say, launch with a bang, if you don't make the right investments early on, people judge you on what you've achieved when you really weren't trying to achieve at that point, right? All you were trying to do was figure things out for yourself. So I think perceptions really was maybe one of those weak areas for us in the first few years, where we said we're only bootstrapped, so we don't need to make ourselves as visible. We don't need to we behaved like a small brand versus sort of trying to compete with the big ones. Maybe that would have sort of given us a slightly different trajectory early on in our journey. But other than that, I think I loved every bit of our journey. Incrementally, of course, if we had done a lot of different things differently, we could have ended up somewhere else. But I can't think of one big thing that we should have done, which would have sort of given us a very different story.
So now, you have life is your oyster. You have a nice open canvas that you can paint in front of you. So what's next for you, and, what are your plans?
I'm chilling right now. This is the first time in 12 years that I have nothing to do. And in that sense, nothing to aspire to as well, right? In terms of I don't have something lined up yet and stuff like that, which is very liberating, very, very liberating feeling to be able to wake up every day and say, I'm going to do today what I want to do. Mm-hmm. I like to learn, right? Anything and everything that I've done in my career has always been driven from a thirst to learn something new. So I get bored otherwise, right? So whatever I do next, I know that I'm going to want to either definitely build on what I've done at Smoothie, so bigger, better, in terms of whether it'll be entrepreneurial or sort of working somewhere. I don't know. Thinking through various options, thinking through how I feel about them as well. I'm being open about it.
Yeah, amazing. And wish you all the best.
Thank you
for your next innings, whatever that is.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming in here and talking to us about how you built your business and your entire journey. And I'm sure everybody who's watching would love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.